Welcome to this video, where we'll be taking a look at the Oxi One Sequencer by Oxi, and more specifically, how to get all connected and working with Ableton or your DAW. We'll look into how to sequence Ableton instruments, assign Oxi's LFO to MIDI parameters, and using the Oxi as a master clock with Ableton as a slave. First things first, let's turn on the Oxi and plug in the USB. I have the USB plugged into my computer, which is obviously being recognized in Ableton. First, let's dive into the preferences of Ableton. Go into Live and then Preferences, and we'll go to our Link MIDI tab. Now we see we have Oxi 1 and Oxi Port 2, and then same with the outputs, Oxi 1 Port 1, Oxi 1 Port 2. So first, we want Ableton to input the notes from the Oxi One so we can sequence Ableton's instruments with the Oxi. So we're going to enable track, and I'm just going to do the same thing for port 1 and port 2. Now the difference between port 1 and port 2 is just the two MIDI tracks that the Oxi has of A and B. And we also want to be able to receive MIDI CC information for modulating parameters in Ableton from the Oxi, like using the LFO. So we're going to enable the remote. And we're going to leave the sync off for now because we don't want Ableton to be receiving sync information. We want it to be sending sync information. So we go down to the output for Oxi One and turn on sync for those. And that's all we have to do in the preferences. And now we'll see when I hit play in Ableton, it's playing our Oxi. Now for this demonstration, I'm going to go into channel 3 here. And let's adjust the scale. Let's just go to a minor and just pick a root note here. And now with our instrument I have here on channel 1, I'm going to go to MIDI from, and we'll do Oxi port 1. And we'll set the MIDI channel, which is channel 3 for the chord mode, channel 3 default on the Oxi. So you can see we're getting chord information from the Oxi into Ableton. And now we'll look at sequencing drums with the Oxi, where I'm going to enable the drum track here. And I have it set in Oxi 1, and we're going to do channel 4 for the multi-track channel here. So we see we could get all our notes or drum samples on Ableton from the Oxi. But with the sequencer mode, when I have it on preview here, it's not giving us all of our drums, and especially not our kick drum. So what we want to do is actually we hold our note, and we could turn this encoder here and get to our specific drum we need. So you can see how we could easily access all of our drums in the drum track with just these 8 channels. And I don't think you're going to be using more than 8 hits at one time, so it's perfectly fine. And now let's look at mapping LFO to Ableton. So I'm just going to clear out our track here and go to channel 3 where we have our poly setup here. Now, assigning the LFO or CC messages to Ableton, it's worth noting that you should do this before you sequence your notes, otherwise the sequence notes are going to disrupt your MIDI assignment. So I'm going to go into LFO 1 here, and we shift click the destination to get to our external MIDI destination, and we could turn our control here, and let's just go to CC39. Now we turn our amount up, otherwise it won't register in Ableton. And now we just go Command M or Control M if you're on Windows to the MIDI map mode, and we go to our MIDI that we want to assign. I'm just going to go to the reverb here and just hit play in Ableton, And then notice that when we hit play, first it assigns the play button to that MIDI map, but then the LFO takes over. So now before we hit stop on the Oxi, we want to get out of the MIDI map mode, and then we can hit stop, and we see that it is turning our send A. Now to do the second LFO, first we have to turn the LFO1 amount down to 0 again, so that doesn't interfere with assigning LFO2. And we go to LFO2, we do the same thing, and let's just go to 65 here. Turn the amount up, go back to our MIDI mode, select send B, hit play, get out of our MIDI mode, hit stop, and now we go back to LFO1, turn that amount back up, and now you see on the screen we have our two LFOs turning the send. And now we're free to map our notes in the sequence without disrupting the MIDI assignment. Now, one more thing I want to look at in this video is assigning Ableton as a slave to the master clock of the Oxi. Now, to do that, all we have to do is go back into our live preferences, and where we had the sync off on the input, we turn it on, and then we turn it off on the output. And now when we hit play on Ableton, we're not getting anything on the Oxi because it's not receiving that sync. But we hit this external sync switch on Ableton. Now Ableton is not running the clock. It's receiving clock from the Oxi. I play on the Oxi and it plays in Ableton. Now it's worth noting that you do have to play with your buffer setting and your driver error compensation a bit to get the least amount of lag between the Oxi and Ableton. Otherwise, Ableton's not the best. It's a little wonky with it being a slave to something other than another Ableton. And that is the Oxi One Sequencer and Ableton. Now in the next video, I'll jump backwards a little bit and make a little quick start guide for the Oxi Sequencer for everything you need to know to get rolling once you get this beauty into your hands. And that's it for this video. Until next time.